Good morning. This is going to be a little tricky. What I originally wanted to do was to present some of Mathew Franklin Whittier's early social reform literature. And specifically, I want to concentrate on the issue of Debtors Prison. There's an 1832 editorial that he wrote that I'm going to read in its entirety. And then there's a book published in 1834 called The Debtors Prison, which I have an original copy of. And I'm going to read quite a bit of that. I think I'm going to really get into it, 2 or 3 chapters. And anybody can click out anytime they want to. We'll have it for the future. But first I want to get into this issue of Charles Dickens and what he was doing. They were both born 1812. I think Dickens was a little bit older. Mathew started writing as a boy of 12 in 1825. Now, I would have to really go back in and try to pick up what's the first instance of him writing about any aspect of social reform. And I haven't done that this morning, but I do have some idea of Charles Dickens' history. So I'm going to go over that. And I'm so ignorant about Dickens that I didn't know that the Pickwick Papers had to do with Debtors Prison. I just found that out this morning. Again, as I mentioned yesterday, I am approaching this from the perspective of Mathew Franklin Whittier and Abby Poyen Whittier. I'm not a Dickens scholar. So, what I know about Dickens, I've picked up. What I find is that the deeper I delve into him, the more my impressions are confirmed, rather than vice versa. And I'll give you my impressions first before we launch into a little exploration of Dickens. He was obviously had a lot of talent. He was bright. He was shallow and he was theatrical and he was kind of a base character. He was, he could write social comedy, but then his talent brought him into contact with deeper people, illustrators and authors. And he would, by hook or crook, one way or another, he would steal their ideas or use their ideas, and he would put his clever theatrical spin on it, which was very popular, especially with the shallow masses, the people that vote to decide who's going to be famous. See, he appealed to them because they aren't deep either, see? So he took the work of deeper people and reworked it. And he was very good at reworking and popularizing other people's ideas. This is how he got famous. And this is what I see as his work, including in A Christmas Carol, except in his earlier works, he was dealing with ideas that were given him by his illustrators. And even in the Pickwick Papers, he apparently wrote that based on Robert Seymour's illustrations. And then when he claimed, authorship of this, Robert Seymour committed suicide. And Dickens was not particularly concerned about it or didn't seem to have any remorse about it. That's the way I read the history. I could be wrong, but that's what I'm reading in between the lines. Dickens stole Seymour's ideas and Seymour tried to say something about it and couldn't get anywhere with it and killed himself. And Dickens had visited him the night before. Clearly they had talked about it, and so far as I know, Dickens never expressed any remorse about it, took any responsibility for it. So you see the kind of character that we have. So as far as his history is concerned, Dickens was a freelance law reporter from 1829 to 31. He was a parliamentary reporter for the Mayor of Parliament, 1831-32, a reporter for the True Sun in 1832-34. I'm getting this from the Dickens Fellowship, dickensfellowship.org. So, and then the Pickwick Papers was his first novel that was based on Robert Seymour's illustrations. He took the illustrations and he strung them together into a narrative, apparently. Well, Robert Seymour, a man of social conscience, probably was concerned about Debtors Prison and drew illustrations having to do with Debtors Prison. And that's, why Dickens began focusing on that topic, not because he was genuinely a social reformer. I think he got that reputation and he had to play it. Being an actor, he played the part of a social reformer. That's still my personal opinion. Um, let's see, on something called the Dickens page, charlesdickenspage.com, I pulled out a quote, so I'll go ahead and read it. It is not surprising that Charles Dickens' extraordinary powers of observation were sharpened early on as a journalist. In early 1832, Dickens, after a brief career as a solicitor's clerk and teaching himself shorthand, became a parliamentary reporter for the Mayor of Parliament, a newspaper owned by his mother's brother, John Henry Barrow. He was also doing parliamentary reporting for the True Sun, a new radical newspaper. Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if he's reporting for a radical newspaper. That might suggest that he was liberal. I don't know in what sense he was liberal. If he just managed to get the job, we don't know. Pickwick Papers was published in 1837. Mathew started publishing in a major literary newspaper, the Boston New England Galaxy, in 1825. There's, I can tell, the spring of 1825. And he did critiques on popular poetry, and I mean, he tackled some meaty issues, but when he started talking social reform, I'm not totally sure. Certainly by the time he got to New York City, he was the unnamed junior editor, I think the acting editor of the New York Constellation from sometime in 1830 until mid-1832 when there was a big cholera epidemic and he had to leave finally. This work is attributed to the editor-in-chief, Asa Greene, and it's not Asa Greene, it's Mathew Franklin Whittier. Likewise, the books that were written, there were 5 books published from 1833, 1834 that are attributed to Asa Greene, even though the only place you'll see Asa Greene's name on them is where they were registered. You know, otherwise it's Mathew's work, and his editor-in-chief, Asa Greene, was helping him get some of them published. So historians are just simply mistaken on that. Problem with some of these things is that there's only 2 or 3 or 4 historians that have ever bothered with these things, see? So, you know, if one person or 2 people study Asa Greene and they get it wrong, then for all of academia, Asa Greene was the author of these books. See, nobody questions it because nobody cares, particularly except these 2 guys. So, you know, it's kind of a conundrum. So that's Dickens. What I'm going to show today is it's very difficult to prove that Mathew Franklin Whittier was more likely to have written the social reform aspect of A Christmas Carol, you know, where it talks about poverty and debtors' prison and workhouses and all of that. It would be a back and forth thing to try to argue that with somebody that Dickens was not really a social reformer, that he started out being a frivolous writer and only started talking about social reform when he started borrowing other people's ideas. I can make a case for that. If I'm up against somebody who's a deep Dickens scholar who studied Dickens for 30 years, they might be able to out-argue me, you know, on that. I don't know. It's kind of out of my area. What I can show is that Mathew Franklin Whittier appears to have been first in this matter, and that I would say he was more sincere, was original, and he was at least as likely to have written. I mean, we'll back it up to that point. I can prove that Mathew was at least as likely to have written the social reform elements in A Christmas Carol as Charles Dickens was. So as for more likely, that's a slippery slope, you know. And likewise with Abby Poyen, the other co-author of A Christmas Carol, was deeply concerned with social issues. So what I think I'm going to do, just to give you an idea, is to read from A Dinner at Poplar Walk, which is Charles Dickens' first published fictional piece that I personally know of. And just to give you an idea of what Dickens is like on his own without anybody else's influence. As soon as I get this to launch, here it is. Dickens had 2 sides to him, apparently. One of them was kind of humorous and clever and frivolous, and the other one was dark, you know, and vulgar, you know, and concerned with the worst of human nature. So you'll see both of these themes in Dickens, and they're both his. The social reform, I don't think that was genuine. But anyway, I'm going to read this. I got to turn it this way, and I'll just start out at the beginning, and then I'll dip into it a little bit, and then we're done with this. Mr. Augustus Minns was a bachelor of about 40, as he said, of about 8 and 40, as his friends said. He was always exceedingly clean, precise, and tidy, perhaps somewhat priggish, and the most retiring man in the world. He usually wore a brown frock coat without a wrinkle, light inexplicables without a spot, a neat neckerchief with a remarkably neat tie, and boots without a fault. Moreover, he always carried a brown silk umbrella with an ivory handle. He was a clerk in Somerset House, or, as he said himself, he held, quote, a responsible situation under government. He had a good and increasing salary in addition to some 10,001 of his own invested in funds, and he occupied a first floor in Tavistock Street. And it goes on describing this character. And then there he is at a dinner. "I'll break the ice, my love," said Mr. Budden, stirring up the sugar at the bottom of his glass of brandy and water, and casting a sidelong look at his spouse to see the effect of the announcement of his determination, "by asking Minns down to dine with us on Sunday." "Then pray, Budden, write to your cousin at once," replied Mrs. Budden. "Who knows, if we could only get him down here, but he might take a fancy to our Alexander and leave him his property. Alec, my dear, take your legs off the rail of the chair." "Very true," said Mr. Budden, musing. "Very true indeed, my love." On the following morning, as Mr. Minns was sitting at his breakfast table, alternately biting his dry toast and casting a look up the columns of his morning paper, which he always read from the title to the printer's name, he heard a loud knock at the street door, which was shortly afterwards followed by the entrance of his servant, who put into his hands a particularly small card on which was engraven in immense letters, quote, "Mr. Octavius Budden, Amelia Cottage," Mrs. B's name was Amelia, "Poplar Walk, Stamford Hill." And he's still getting into this, but this is a dinner, and it's silly, and it's satirical, social satire, and so on. I'm getting bored. I'm afraid that I'm boring everybody else here. So I'm going to stop. Of course, you can find this online easily enough. But that gives you an idea of what Dickens was writing on his own merits, you know. Now we're going to go to, that was, I think it's 33. That's 1833, if I'm not mistaken. Now we're going to go to 1832. This is Mathew Franklin Whittier. This is unsigned. It's an editorial written for the New York Constellation, January 7, 1832. It's entitled The Debtors Prison. This is not Asa Greene, by the way. This is Mathew Franklin Whittier. I've proven it many times over, and I can't go into the proof now. So it begins, "Among the scraps," which was the title of a book, "lately published by Johnson," which should be Johnston, I think, "is one entitled, quote, 'An Incarcerated Monster.' It represents a poor debtor within the walls of a grated prison, half clothed and half famished, holding in his hand a letter from his wife, which he has just read. It contains these few words: 'I have sold your tools and even our beds, but all will but save our little ones from starving. Your heartbroken wife.' At the window of the cell stands a group of visitors, between whom the following conversation is represented as taking place." Now, I found this online. This cartoon is by David Claypool Johnston, who lived from 1799 to 1865. He came out with a series of these scraps. This one was the 1832 edition. I found this. Let's see, Library Company of Philadelphia, who prefer to have a citation. So there's our citation. You can look them up. And I will show these on the screen as I'm reading. "Child: Oh, what an ill-looking wretch. Is he a murderer, Pa? Father: No, my dear, but what is worse, he's an insolvent debtor. Mother: Oh, the monster. Hanging's too good for him, but I suppose he owes none but poor folks and such kind of trash. Father: Were that the case, my dear, it is most likely he would now be pursuing his business. Fortunately, however, he owes upwards of $10 to one of our richest, and of course one of our first and most respectable citizens, who has sent him here to meet the reward of his villainy. Mother: How fortunate it is that we have first and respectable citizens. If it weren't for them, I do believe the crime of poverty would almost always go unpunished. Matthew's quoting this cartoon. He says, this is indeed, now let me stop and say, Matthew is a man of conscience who strongly and powerfully believes that these things need to be righted because of his deep compassion for the sufferers and his very strong sense of justice. Dickens is a sensationalist who uses these things as fodder for popular literature. It's a totally different vibe, and I don't understand why people haven't picked up on this more than possibly some have, but you have to compare the real thing to the phony in order to see the difference, So Matthew continues, this is indeed a severe and touching commentary on the crime of poverty. Crime it may well be called when it is visited with such awful consequences. Here, and it is not a picture of the imagination merely, we behold a man, a fellow being like ourselves, shut out from all the sympathies of society, separated from his wife and children, driven from his trade or daily labor, upon the fruits of which they depend for a livelihood, and locked up in a dungeon without the barest possibility of supporting himself or his famishing family. But the gnawings of hunger are but as nothing to the pangs of his agonized soul. We will suppose him to be honest, that he contracted the debt for which he is confined, with the full determination of paying it, but was prevented from doing so by sickness, by want of employment, or by some other unforeseen casualty. The time comes round when the debt is due. He is called upon by his creditor. He begs for a little indulgence, for a few weeks or days when he will be enabled to satisfy the whole. But no, his creditor will not wait, and he is seized by the strong hand of the law and hurried away from the bosom of his family, from the enjoyments of domestic life, from the fresh air of heaven, the light of day, the most common pleasures of existence, and thrown into a prison like the veriest wretch who is sent there to await the execution of the sentence of death pronounced upon him. If there is any calamity in life most galling to the feelings of a man, conscious of his own rectitude and integrity of purpose, it surely is this. It were enough, it would seem, to drive him mad and to make him a fitter subject for the walls of an insane asylum than those of a debtor's prison. Anybody watching that gets bored can just move the cursor over. This is the digital age. But if I don't read this, I can't, people of the future can't put it in, or maybe they can, I don't know, with deep fakes. But I'm going to go ahead and read, and you can just move that cursor right on over. On to our debtor's prison. Visit the one in your own city, reader. It stands close beside the city hall and is but a few steps out of your path as you pass along Broadway. Go in here. You will find the attendants obliging and humane men, notwithstanding the hard necessity of their office, and witness the sad and wretched condition of the poor inmates of this comfortless abode. There they stand, 20 or more, shivering over the stove and looking the picture of woe. They eye you as you enter. If you are a stranger, they conclude, perhaps, that you have come to take up permanent lodgings with themselves, that, in the slang of the prison house, you are a new pin, just knocked on the head and driven close into the black hole. They flock round, but shortly they perceive their mistake, and you are left unmolested by their inquisitive glances. It is your turn now to mark their countenance, and you may read there volumes of misery. You see the sunken eye, the cadaverous cheek, the look which tells of hope deferred and the spirit broken and dejected. You shrink, perhaps, from the touch of these wretched objects, as if from the hand of pollution. They are not so nice and cleanly, it is true, as they once were, when you meet them in the morning going to their labors. Their apartments are so confined, their accommodations so pitiful, and their conveniences so few, that it were next to impossible for them to keep otherwise, even were they so disposed, than in the filthy state you now see them. But they are now reckless and regardless of their personal appearance. They have lost that nice sense of propriety which distinguishes civilized men from the savage. They feel themselves outcasts from society, and they care not how soon every link is severed which once bound them to it. We have been thus minute in our examinations, not to excite the disgust or to shock the sensibilities of our readers, but that we might exhibit to them some of the unhappy effects of the law of imprisonment for debt. Mathew is telling us he is not a sensationalist. For ourselves, we have frequently witnessed the scene described and have listened to the heartrending tale of some imprisoned debtor. We lately received a note from an inmate of our jail in whom we had become interested and whose release we were endeavoring to effect, which we give entire, only suppressing names. And this is a rather pitiful letter from an inmate that he's trying to help. That's as far as we need to go. Now, there are people who will come up with excellent examples of Mathew's sincere concern and interest in social reform. I don't believe it. I think he was an actor. We know he was an actor. I think he was acting the part. And there we must leave it. I leave it to each person to examine that question on their own. But we have established that as of 1832, Mathew, at age 20, actually age 19, I think at this point, that Mathew was fully capable of that kind of work and clearly evinced a strong social conscience. This is, so far as I know, well before Charles Dickens was writing any such thing. I might be wrong because I can't get into his actual reporting of that early era, but I would have to guess that that is the case, and that Mathew was writing this kind of work well before Charles Dickens was, and they were the same age. Now, here we have the Debtors Prison. I'm looking for the title page, and this is so fragile, you got to be really careful. Here's the Debtors Prison, a tale of a revolutionary soldier. Of course, Mathew has picked a revolutionary soldier because such people were venerated and admired. And yet here we are putting them into prison. I mean, the same thing happens today when we talk about homeless vets. That's basically what this is. He's chosen a homeless vet. Now, I'm going to read an extended excerpt. And again, you've got that little cursor. You can just move right on over. But I have to show that Mathew was an excellent novelist. I have to show that he was sincerely concerned about these social issues. And this is Mathew's first serious novel. The others are humorous and satirical, and satire is serious in its own way. But this is his first, novelette, I would say, on a serious topic. You will see this style of writing developed in his 1855 anonymous book called The Rag Picker, or Bound and Free, which was falsely claimed by, briefly, and then falsely attributed to Mathew's plagiarist, one of his many plagiarists, George P. Burnham. Rag Picker was not written by George P. Burnham. That's one of the most obvious ones, that I've run across, the easiest ones to disprove. So I'm going to launch into this. By the way, here we have entered according to Act of Congress in the year 1835, although it's an 1834 book, by Bliss, Wadsworth and Company in the office of the Clerk of the District Court of the United States for the Southern District of New York. There's no mention of Asa Greene there. Let me see, is there any mention of Asa Greene in this book at all? My copy is 1835, but I believe this was first published 1834. Well, in this 1835 edition, Asa Greene's name doesn't come into this at all that I can see. It may be in the earlier one, because Asa Greene may have helped Mathew publish the first edition, and then Mathew may have published the second one on his own. I don't know how that went down. And here we go. Preface. To illustrate some of the evils attending imprisonment for debt is the main design of the following story. To this barbarous institution the author has ever been decidedly opposed, believing that, while it is cruel and injurious to the debtor, it is in general utterly useless to the creditor. In this belief, he is happy to find that so many of his fellow citizens concur, and that the opinion is daily gaining ground. Nevertheless, even in this enlightened age and country, a majority of the people, or what in effect amounts to the same thing, a majority of our legislators, seem still to be in favor of imprisoning the debtor. How small a proportion of states out of the 24 have emancipated themselves from this ancient and odious thraldom. And in one of these, the state of New York, they are not wanting persons who are active in their exertions to bring back the former condition of things and to restore the law to the barbarism of former ages. So in New York, it's been abolished, but there are people trying to bring it back. That these persons may not succeed in their endeavors, that New York may stand fast in her enlightened position, and that other states may follow the example first set by a younger sister in the far west, is the fervent wish of the author. March 15, 1834. So that's when he wrote the preface, was 34. Presumably he'd finished the book by that time. The Debtors Prison, Chapter 1. I live at a considerable distance from the city of New York, and in a spot so lonely that it is almost imperious upon me occasionally to entertain the wayfaring man. But aside from this, the person of whom I am about to speak, and the circumstances under which he came to my habitation, precluded the moral possibility of turning him from my door. It was in the depth of winter in the year 1820 that I was sitting in my armchair one evening about 11 o'clock when my wife and children were in bed, and I was toasting my feet for the last time after having raked up the fire, that I heard a knock at the door. Who can come to pay me a visit at this unseasonable hour, in this lonely situation, and in this perilous weather, thought I. Doctor, I am none, and I thank heaven for it. Notice that Asa Greene was a doctor. Doctor, I am none, and I thank heaven for it, to be sent for in all weathers to aid the body of the suffering sick. Priest, I am none, that I should be called upon to comfort the soul in extremis. What then can be the object of this unseasonable visit? But I did not take as long to reason and debate with myself as I have been in writing the last dozen words. The thoughts passed through my mind, but they passed rapidly, and I immediately arose, not to unbar the door, for I live where neither bars nor bolts are necessary, but I arose to let in the person, whoever he might be. Come in, said I, in God's name, do not stand exposed longer to this bitter cold weather. Come in and warm you. I said this before I had fairly got the door open, but as soon as I had done this, I beheld a man lying on the stepping stone, with his head on the threshold of the door. I spoke kindly to him, but he seemed insensible. He had fallen down, exhausted with traveling and benumbed with the cold. At first I feared he was dead, but on carrying him in and calling up my wife and daughters, we succeeded by rubbing his limbs and by the use of cordials, which were forced into his mouth, in restoring him to sense and animation. He seemed a man about 70 years of age. His thin locks were white as the snow without, and his cheek was deeply furrowed, as much apparently with wretchedness as with time. His clothes were but the tattered remnants of what had once been garments, made apparently for other persons besides the wearer. They were the gifts of charity, which, though it is said to hide a multitude of sins, were scarcely sufficient to cover the skin of the wayfaring man. They would have been insufficient to exclude the sun in summer. They proved a most miserable barrier against the cold in winter. The countenance of the old man was not without interest, and my daughters, who had been reading tales of romance, and especially the historical novels of Cooper, declared from the first moment they saw him that he could be no less than the hero of some tale which would no doubt be interesting if known, and particularly if committed to paper. But who knows, said Lucy, the eldest, but what it is committed to paper and published? Why, do you think, said Harriet, that the hero of a written and published tale would be wandering abroad without clothing and without shelter this bitter cold night? Why not, replied Lucy. Now the thought strikes me that he is no other than the hero of Cooper's Spy. What, Harvey Birch? The same. You know, Harriet, that he is just about the age that Harvey Birch would be by this time. You know that Harvey was a real character of the Revolution, that he passed through many hairbreadth escapes, and wandered about in poverty and disgrace, exposed to cold, hunger, and thirst, in order to serve his country. And you know likewise that our republic, like all other republics, which are ever ungrateful, has not in all instances rewarded the sufferings or even supplied the necessities of our revolutionary heroes. Do not say a word against republics, said Harriet. You know I am a Republican, heart and soul. So am I, retorted Lucy, but I am not blind. Hush, hush, girls, said I. This is no time for a dispute in politics or for a discussion of romance. A fellow creature lies apparently dead before us, and whether he be a revolutionary hero or not, whether he be Harvey Birch or some other obscure individual with an unwritten name, it imports not our duty to know. True, replied Harriet, who was busily engaged in rubbing his temples, but I hope in mercy he isn't dead, for though I don't think with Lucy that he's any ways related to Harvey Birch, I should like of all things to hear the story of his adventures. So Matthew set the stage, put a little bit of humor there, introduced his characters. As she said this, Harriet redoubled her assiduities upon the old man's temples, and as Lucy and her mother were each engaged with one of his hands, and I employed at his breast, we very soon had the satisfaction of seeing him show unequivocal signs of life. In a short time he so far recovered as to be able to speak, and after some confusion of ideas incidental to his situation had passed away, to thank us for the attentions we had shown him. He appeared very grateful. He pressed the hands of my wife and daughters and fervently kissed them, while Harriet, turning to Lucy, exclaimed in a whisper, "What a gallant man he must have been in his younger days. I am so glad he has come to life, for now we shall have a chance to learn his story, and I'll be bound it's an interesting one." "I have no doubts of it," replied Lucy, who had still the hero of the spy running in her head, "and then we shall see how far his real history accords with that given of him in the character of Harvey Birch." "Strange, sister," returned Harriet, "you will be so silly as to persist in that idea. This gentleman, for I'm sure he is a gentleman, notwithstanding his rags, can't have been so low a character as the spy, who, you know, followed the business of a mere peddler. This man must have been a colonel or a major at least." I was now obliged to interfere once more to allay the rising controversy of my daughters, which I did this time with a stern look. The truth is, they are very good girls in the main, but their heads are a little too much filled with romance, heroes, heroines, and all that trash which comes of novel reading. This is Matthew's little editorial slipped in. My wife also reminded them that it was now getting very late, and they had better retire again to rest, especially as tomorrow would be washing day, and they would be required to rise early in the morning. The girls retired like obedient daughters, but Harriet first stopped to ask in a whisper if she should not warm the best bed for the stranger, for that the sheets, not having been slept in since they were washed a month before, must be cold and damp. "Get you to bed," repeated her mother, "and I'll see to the comforts of the poor old man. He shall sleep warm, depend on it." My wife is a very kind body, but she is also a very nice one, and therefore did not relish the idea of putting a wandering beggar in her best bed. But she made up a very warm and comfortable one for him near the kitchen fire, which, having all the substantials of rest and ease, she averred was as good as the best, and certainly as good as a man of the stranger's appearance could expect. But he was no ordinary beggar. He did not importune like the generality of that race. He, in fact, asked for nothing. On the contrary, when my wife was bustling about getting his supper and preparing his bed, he begged she would not give herself any trouble, that he was not worth the least of her cares or attention, that the merest crust which a well-preserved set of teeth would readily enable him to masticate would suffice him for food, and that for lodging he would be perfectly satisfied if she would allow him to encamp on the bare floor. "Encamp on the floor!" exclaimed my wife. "No, that you shan't. No person in my house shall sleep on the floor. We're not such brutes as that comes to." "It is a long time since I have had a softer lodging," said the stranger. "And more's the pity then," said my wife. The old man, having got thoroughly warmed and satisfied his hunger, was now left to his repose, and my wife and myself retired to ours. Now, of course, this is all a setup for the old man to tell his story, which is the bulk of the little novel here. Chapter 2. In the morning, the stranger was accommodated with one of my clean shirts, and with a suit of my outside apparel, which, though a little the worse for wear, was nearly 100% better than his. He was also persuaded to make use of my razor, which a beard of nearly a month's growth rendered altogether necessary to a decent appearance. When this was done, and he had been refreshed by a warm breakfast, he appeared considerably younger than he had seemed the night before. Indeed, he was altogether a man of an interesting appearance. Though bent of years, he had the port and carriage of one who had seen better days, and my daughters were more and more confirmed in their first impression that he was one of our revolutionary veterans, that he had fought in those times which tried men's souls, and must be the hero of a tale worth hearing at least, if not worth writing a novel upon. For my part, too, I thought it very probable he had borne arms in the Revolution, not, however, so much from any peculiarity in his person or manners, as from the well-known fact that almost every American of his age had shared in the perils, the sufferings, and the glory of that war of independence. I did not forget, moreover, that many of our revolutionary veterans were passing their old age in poverty, and though the government had, very tardily, pensioned many, yet there were others who had too much pride to apply for the bounty, to pass through the formality of proving themselves utterly destitute, in order to render them proper subjects of the reward of their country. I should not, however, have judged, from the bearing of my guest, that he possessed much of that stubborn pride which would prevent a man from appealing to his country's bounty, especially where the absence of poverty or of proof to substantiate it could be no obstacle to the attainment of that bounty. He seemed rather to be divested of pride, to be broken in spirit, if not in heart, to wander about reckless of the world, reckless of poverty or distress, a victim of despair and wanting only the presumptuous daring of the suicide to rid himself of a weary and miserable life. There was something singular in his manner and the expression of his countenance when silent, when not addressed in conversation, or when left to the current of his own thoughts. He seemed absent-minded. He scarcely opened his mouth unless spoken to, and shortly relapsed again into what seemed his habitual state of reverie. He was not what could be called insane, and yet, if I may so speak, he was not exactly in his right mind. His answers on all subjects were perfectly rational, and his conversation, when he could be induced to open his mouth, was that of a sensible and well-informed man. My women folks had various conjectures of their own as to the cause of his erratic course, as to the evident wandering of his mind as well as his body. Harriet, who had lately been reading The Sorrows of Werter, thought he must have been crossed in love. Lucy, whose mind was still full of the idea of Harvey Birch and the ingratitude of republics, would have it that he was suffering from the neglect of his country, while their mother, who abhors everything in the shape of idleness or inattention to household matters, declared it to be her fixed opinion that he had a lazy slut for a wife. I don't know, but slut probably didn't have the same connotation back then. As for the object of these conjectures, he seemed to take little notice of what was going on around him, but sat looking alternately at the kitchen fire and then at his new clothes, the change in which seemed not a little to excite his attention, while my wife and daughters were actively engaged in their various household matters. I had my stock to see to at the barn, and the fires to look to in the house, and thus the short winter's day was employed. I had some difficulty in keeping my guest from wandering abroad again during the day, for several times he was on the point of leaving us and committing himself anew to the dreary winter and the untrodden road. I brought him back and urged his stay, at least until the weather and the roads should be more tolerable. "Why would you go now?" said I. "The cold is quite too severe for the endurance of even a much younger man, and the snow is too deep for the strength of one so time-worn and enfeebled as you." "I thank you," said he, "but I fear I shall be burdensome. I am a poor, miserable old man, whose few remaining days can scarcely be worth preservation, and whose life can be of no service to anybody. Besides," added he, looking at his changed apparel, "I am already too much indebted to your bounty. Let me thank you therefore again, and depart on my way." Now he's building a character who has integrity, obviously. "But whither would you go?" said I, gently detaining him. "It is all one to me whether I go," he replied. Then looking wildly around him, he exclaimed, "A jailbird! I would not again be a jailbird to merit heaven. No, I would wander to the ends of the earth first. The cold snows of this lonely road are nothing to the cold walls of a dreary prison. Let me go then. Do not detain me. Do not you cast me into prison. Nay then, but I will free myself. I will not go thither again. As he said this, he wildly burst from me and rushed from the house. But his strength, which had been increased for the moment, presently gave way, and before he had gone a dozen paces, he fell exhausted in the snow. I raised him and led him into the house. He had now become calm again, and I had little difficulty in persuading him that I was not among his persecutors, and that I intended him nothing but kindness. Now, if you ask me, this is well written. Matthew is building the suspense, gradually introducing clues as to who this man is, and, establishing his character and so on. My wife and daughters also assured him that he had no enemies to fear in our house, but at the words jailbird, prison, and the like, which had just escaped him, they began to stare wonderfully, and various conjectures and suspicions were expressed as well by their looks as their words. My wife thought he must be an old convict who had escaped from the Simsbury mines, whither she said she had no doubt he had been righteously sentenced for life in consequence of having committed forgery, burglary, breach of promise, or some such naughty and capital offense. But his lazy slut of a wife, said I, you have changed your mind about her? Not at all, said she. I've no doubt, but he had a lazy, slatternly, good-for-nothing wife that drove him, poor man, to the commission of those naughty crimes, and so had him sent to the Simsbury mines. As for the girls, they had no suspicion, a little humor thrown in, see, and kind of a foil. She's kind of a foil to the man of the house. As for the girls, they had no suspicion that any infamy or disgrace attached to him. He was too much the hero of their imagination to admit of a thought so degrading. Lucy believed he had been confined in the Jersey prison ship in the time of the Revolution, and that his extreme sufferings on that occasion had shattered his mind and caused those aberrations which even now continued to affect his repose, while Harriet, rejecting that idea as quite too far-fetched, if not altogether improbable, thought he must have been taken up on suspicion of being the perpetrator of a very bloody and mysterious murder which had happened in a distant part of the state about 2 years before, and that, after being confined in a dungeon upwards of a year, he had been at last brought to trial and finally set at liberty because he was found not to be the right man. But all these various conjectures of my women folks only increased their desire to learn the old man's adventures, for, whether it were crime or misfortune which had brought him to his present wretched condition, they were eager to listen to the particulars thereof. Their household duties, therefore, were hurried over with the greatest dispatch. The girls had wrung out their clothes and hung them on the lines to dry, and my wife, having got an early cup of hyson, accompanied with the substantial fare of the country, we all partook, not excepting the old man, our wandering and suspicious guest. To be sure, said my wife, though he has been guilty of manslaughter or burglary or breach of promise or some such naughty crime, and though he has escaped from the Simsbury mines, yet after all is said and done, he is flesh and blood, what there is of him, the same as ourselves. And who are we to set at naught our brother, as the Scripture says? We must leave him to heaven, to his own conscience and the laws, and then maybe, after all, he's not so guilty as he appears to be. Who knows? At all events, as soon as we've done tea, I do hope Mr. Hartwell, that's apparently the last name of the family, you'll ask him to tell his adventures. Do, Pa, said the girls. That's a dear good man. So he's setting up the story. Note that where he talks about Christianity, Matthew is sincerely a Christian, having been raised Quaker. This is not something he's put on. For my own part, I had some curiosity as well as the weaker vessels of my family. And therefore, as soon as the tea things were out of the way, and my wife had taken her knitting, the girls their sewing, and I my armchair, I informed the old man that it would give us great pleasure, if he had no objection, to hear an account of the various adventures which I was sure a man of his age and appearance must, at one time or other, have passed through. That he had figured in the scenes of the Revolution, I told him I had no doubt, and that I never could be weary of listening to the exploits of those bold and spirited men who had taken their lives in their hands for the establishment of our independence. At first, he seemed a little startled at my request, looked wildly round, and apparently meditated an escape by the door. But I assured him he was entirely among friends, that it was with no malicious intent I had preferred my request, and that he would oblige us all exceedingly by a compliance. My wife and daughters also joined in the request, and lost no time in confirming my assurance, that he was altogether among friends, and that he would give them the greatest pleasure by a recital of the principal events of his life. Thus assured, he presently became calm and collected, and then, having first wiped a tear from his eye, with a tremulous voice and a countenance full of sadness, he thus began. Okay, so as of chapter 3, we are now into the old man's story, and this is the bulk of the book. I'll read a chapter or two just to get into this and maybe fast forward a little bit. Obviously, I'm not going to read the whole book here, but we are at, let's see, 46:34. I can go at least an hour here anyway. Chapter 3, the old man's story. Grab a sip of water here. I have little to relate worth your hearing. I have, it is true, like most men of my years, passed through and taken a part in the scenes of the Revolution, but of exploits or adventures of my own, I have nothing to relate worthy of your admiration. I endeavored to discharge my duty, as became a faithful soldier of the cause in which I had embarked, and for this I received the praise of my superiors and the approbation of my conscience. But thousands of others did the same, who are unknown to my story, and of whom now neither name nor lineage remains. By the blood of these men our independence was achieved, and the principle was established that all mankind are born free and equal, and that each and every one has the undoubted right to the enjoyment of life, liberty emphasized, and the pursuit of happiness. Such was the great principle for which we fought. Such was the great principle which we established, at least in name. But how is it carried out in practice? Our citizens are deprived of their liberty for no fault of their own. They are incarcerated for debt. They are punished for misfortune. Now here's the crux of it. The reason that Matthew has chosen a veteran is not just for effect and sympathy, but for the irony of the thing, that the man has fought for liberty and justice for all, and this man was deprived of his liberty, for an unjust cause. You see before you a victim of the barbarity of the laws and of the cruelty of those who have the power to enforce them. You see a miserable wretch who has become what he is by the operations of the Debtors Prison, caps and small caps. My name is James Freeman. Okay? I was born in the county of Middlesex, state of Massachusetts, in the year blank. Of course, I am now 70 years of age, the time marked out for the limit of the life of man. Why so poor and useless a being has been spared so long, while better and more useful men have been cut off in the morning or the meridian of life, God only knows. But I was not always thus miserable, thus worthless. My early years were happy. At the breaking out of the Revolution, I rushed to battle. I was among the first to resist the oppressors of my country. I stood in the ranks at Lexington when the first blood was shed in the American War. One of the immortal 8 fell by my side, and I myself received a slight wound at the same time, but it did not prevent me from pursuing the fight that memorable day, from following the enemy on their return to Boston. On the contrary, it rather stirred me up the more to avenge the blood of my murdered countrymen. Now, Matthew's raised Quaker. Generally, he's anti-war. At times, he will get behind a noble cause, even though he's certainly against imperialism. So this is a little bit odd for him to be writing in this vein, but he'll do that again with Lajos Kossuth, the Hungarian freedom fighter, later on. So occasionally he will do this. I was among those who took aim from chosen stations by the roadside and helped to thin the enemy's ranks as they pursued their march in disorder to the capital, while others ensconced themselves behind fences, rocks, and tufts of brushwood. I climbed a tree from among the friendly branches, of which I revenged my own smart, and did something to appease the departed spirits of those who had fallen at Lexington. To the manes of those individuals, many a redcoat was sacrificed that day. The tall officers, distinguished by their swords and uniform, afforded a proper mark to the keen-eyed shooters from behind fences, rocks, and trees. 7 men, officers and soldiers, were the fruits of my rifle, and it wanted but the 8th to equal the number of the first American martyrs of the Revolution. I was about taking my aim at one, an officer on horseback, when I was myself descried and brought to the ground by the pistol of my intended victim. I, however, rallied so far as to fire my piece, and though the officer escaped, the horse fell beneath him. Poor animal. Matthew was very concerned about animal rights, so he brings that in here. It was owing to the feebleness of my arm, which had just been a second time wounded, that I fired so low. I had also received a wound in the breast, which ended my fighting for that day, and a confinement of nearly 2 months was the consequence. But I recovered in time to take part in the Battle of Bunker Hill. There I was present in the hottest of the fight. There I saw a Warren fall, and there I remained in the ditch among the last, where I received 2 stabs from a bayonet, which has disabled me for almost a year. But why should I dwell upon these things? It was my fortune and my duty to fight in that war, and I claim no merit for having done so. Others did the same. Nay, many rendered greater services than I, who are nameless and forgotten. For myself, suffice it to say, I continued through the war, having been present in most of the principal engagements from the Battle of Lexington to that of Yorktown. I was engaged with Washington at Monmouth and again at Trenton. I was among the sufferers at Valley Forge, where I was even worse clad than when your charity relieved me last night. I had not so much as a stocking or shoe to my feet, and the winters, you know, in those revolutionary times were much harder than they are now. In a word, I took a share as well in the sufferings as the dangers of the whole revolutionary period. I saw the first and I saw the last of the battles of that day. I was near the martyr Warren when he fell, and I was near the triumphant Washington when he received the sword of Lord Cornwallis. I was wounded in every battle, the scars of which, to the number of more than 20, I can show you now. Yet heaven preserved me through all these dangers. I was not altogether unnoticed, neither by man. I was made a sergeant after the Battle of Lexington, an ensign after that of Bunker Hill, a lieutenant after that of Monmouth, a captain after that of Trenton, a major after, in short, I was so far promoted that the close of the war found me with an epaulet on each shoulder. Now, this is interesting because later on Matthew would write satirically about war as the character of Ensign Stebbings for the Carpetbag, which was not Benjamin Drew, as the editor claimed. So in Ensign Stebbings, Matthew could write very convincingly, including in poetry, and yet it was tongue-in-cheek. See, so Matthew always had this struggle within himself about valiant war for a good cause versus the Quakerism that he'd been brought up in. Quakers were derisively called shaken Quakers, as cowards. And Matthew did not want to be a coward. At the same time, he hated imperialism and war for its own supposed glory, see? So you'll see him kind of work both sides of this question. Matter of fact, he even debated on this question when he was a member of the Nixian Club in Portland. He's said to have debated the question of whether war was consistent with Christian principles, and he was on the pro side and he won, apparently. So, it's not so black and white as saying that Matthew was Quaker and against war and therefore this isn't him. No, it's much more subtle than that. As the old man came to this part of the story, Harriet cast a triumphant glance at Lucy, as much to say, "You know I told you so. I was certain that he had been a field officer at least." Then came the crisis of disbanding the army. That was a time to make the patriot tremble for his country. In the room of a civil, there was danger of a military despotism. For the tyranny of a king and parliament, 3,000 miles off, we were threatened with the rule of a rapacious soldiery. The men had not been paid, and they had arms in their hands. They were poor and naked and clamorous for their money. In this state of things, it wanted but an ambitious as well as a popular leader to have subjected the country to plunder and military rule. I've never read this about the revolution. It's kind of interesting. At least to have stirred up the soldiers to take their pay at the point of the bayonet. As if this condition of things was not bad enough in itself, there were not wanting bold, unprincipled men ready to take advantage of it for the ruin of their country. Now, I knew that there were bands of marauding former soldiers after the Civil War, but I never read that such a condition was there after the Revolutionary War. Then appeared the notorious Newburgh letters urging the soldiers to retain their arms until they should get their pay. Written with ability and appearing to have some show of reason on their side, they were calculated to excite the army to mutiny, and thus to render of no avail the blood and the treasure so lavishly expended by the country in the cause of liberty. The case was indeed a hard one. The poor soldiers had fought long and bravely. They had endured every hardship and suffered every calamity. They were naked and penniless, and to be dismissed to their homes without receiving the miserable pittance due from government was a hardship exceedingly difficult to be endured. So the gist of that is that there was that question. Let's see, and finally the army was peaceably disbanded. He returned to his native state with government securities instead of cash in my pocket, so he was paid something. Then comes the story of how he ended up getting into debt and being thrown into prison, and it gets worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. Where are we in terms of time? I forget where to look. There it is. We're just about at the end of it. So what I'm going to do is just arbitrarily fast forward. Here I've got chapter 11, and I'm just going to read some of chapter 11. When we get to an hour, I will stop. Having no longer any fixed habitation, nor any local attachments, I had no desire, no motive to continue long in any one place. I therefore soon left the state of New York, wandering into Pennsylvania and some other of the middle states where I lived an unsettled life. I think at this point he'd been in prison and managed to get out. Somebody helped him get out or something. I visited the memorable scenes of revolutionary battles. I took a melancholy pleasure in wandering over the grounds of Monmouth, Trenton, Brandywine, and Yorktown. I seemed to converse with the spirits of fallen heroes and to receive from the dead that sympathy which I could not obtain from the living. In short, I delighted to abstract my mind as much as possible from present sufferings by recurring to former dangers, and in imagination to fight the battles of my country over again in order to get rid of the struggles of present grief. And it goes on. I didn't get a very juicy portion. In the middle here, he goes into great detail about the injustices and what happened to his family. And there's some really heart-wrenching stuff in here. Here, I'll read a little bit of chapter 5 to give you an idea. I was driven hard for payment, especially by Mr. Mordaunt, my landlord, of whom I had also purchased oxen, plows, and other things for the use of my farm. I asked for time to turn myself. I stated to him my numerous losses and drawbacks. I reminded him of the unpropitiousness of the late season for the raising of crops or the prosperity of the dairy. I spoke of the murrain which had swept away my cattle and of the sickness which had visited my family. All of these things I pled to my landlord, but I pled to deaf ears. His only reply was I owed him so much money and he must have it without fail. He had nothing to do with my misfortunes. He had not caused them, and he was nowise accountable for them. That was my concern and not his. The only thing he had to do was to look out for his own interests. One thing was certain, I owed him money, and pay it I must. But how can I pay it, said I, without the means? The means, indeed, there it is now. But that, as I said before, is your concern and not mine. You should have thought of that before. So I did, but such have been my misfortunes. I cannot help it, said he, turning his back at the same time. Pay me you must, Major Freeman, or go to jail. He left me, and shortly afterwards my goods were seized for rent. My wife and children turned into the street, and my own person arrested for debt. Then it was that my blood boiled within me. Then it was that I wished my hard-hearted landlord were opposed to me in the ranks of battle, and I with my good sword in my hand. But even that sword was now seized upon, that revolutionary weapon which had sustained me in many an engagement, and finally brought me off victorious along with my triumphant countrymen. That sword was now seized upon, and by a man who had never done anything in his country's cause, who had stayed like a coward at home, while that sword was made red for the common benefit of him and his countrymen. But to turn my wife and babes into the street, that was the unkindest act of all. What had they done that they should be exposed houseless and homeless to the world? What, indeed, had any of us done that we should be at once deprived of our all? We had been visited by the hand of heaven, and because we were thus deprived of the power of fulfilling our engagements, we were made cruelly to suffer at the hand of man. Okay, so you get the idea. There's even more poignant scenes in here. This is Mathew Franklin Whittier at, well, let's see, this would be about age 22 in 1834, depending on when he wrote this. He could have written it sometime in 1833, late 1834. His preface is signed March of 1834. So we're talking 21, 22 years old when Dickens was writing A Dinner at Poplar Walk. I think you get the idea. We don't know how many people have actually watched all of this and how many have dipped into it and how many have just watched the first 3 minutes. But I think I can definitely say that Mathew Franklin Whittier is at least as plausibly the author of those parts of A Christmas Carol which are concerned with social reform and the poor and debtors' prison and workhouses and so on. Mathew set this in London. He was quite aware of the politics of London and England. And he set many other stories in other countries where he had studied and knew the history of those countries. So Mathew and Abby are at least as plausible. Now, I could read you Abby's works too, where she talks about social reform, and that was written before A Christmas Carol was published. But I just wanted to get into Mathew specifically talking about Debtors Prison. And I think I made my case, and I think I will wrap this up. Thank you for watching.